Good morning, student. I am Pratyush Kumar Acharya. I will start with my topic, that is scalar vector, and this is my fourth lecture. In that topic, I will discuss about vector addition by geometrical method. What? Vectors addition by geometrical method. Already I have discussed about what is scalar, what is vector, why use vector, okay, what is the representation of vector, and in which purpose you have used vectors, and there are some properties like as shifting properties, that is parallel shifting of a vector. And second point is two vectors should be create a minimum angle, and that angle which is lies between 0 to 180 degree, okay, and the rotation of vector by creating 360 degree or 2 pi radian, so that it acted along same direction while it becomes in before that one. बुझिपारछ ना पिले? तो ए टॉपिक जाको तुमको मु कोन करथली रिप्रेजेंटेशन करे देथली, किंतु किछि पिलांकर डाउट थिला कोन थिला पैरेलल शिफ्टिंग टा सर कोन आथर कोइ दोस पिले. सपोज दिस इज अ वेक्टर, ओके, दिस इज अ वेक्टर and that vector create an angle theta to that given line, okay. That parallel shifting vector always we have to consider only in mathematical purpose whenever we calculate the some problems. So in that case we have used that parallel shifting, okay. That means calculation purpose we have to use that property like as parallel shifting vector. Suppose this is a vector along in that direction, this is a vector along in that direction. So if the two vectors are joined at a particular point, that means this is a vector and this is a vector, that means that vector becomes parallelly shifted, that vector becomes parallelly shifted, clear? So that type of shifting vector which are used in many purpose, in many calculation purpose. So later I will discuss that one, okay. Why use parallel shifting vector, in which region we have used parallel shifting vector, clear play? So now I will start with my topic, that topic known as vector addition by geometrical method, clear? So whenever we consider the vector addition by geometrical method, so we have known about some general points or general rules. आमे कौन करिया छी जेतेबेले वेक्टर एडिशन बाय ज्योमेट्रिकल मेथड पढिबा ता पूर्वरु आमे जानि रखिया छी किछि रूल को रूल को. सो जनरल रूल ऑफ एडिशन ऑफ टू वेक्टर, दीटा वेक्टर एडिशन रे गोटे पार्टिकुलर रूल आसे, से रूल को आमे कौन रखिबा मन रखिया बाध्य हला. सो प्रथम थला मु एडी लेख, एडी गोटे स्टेटमेंट लिखि छी, से स्टेटमेंट को आमे केमिति बाय हार्ट करिबा. ए स्टेटमेंट आकार आमे सब जिंस को आमे कंसीडर करि परिबा जदरे कि आमे वेक्टर एडिशन बाय ज्योमेट्रिकल मेथड कैलकुलेट करि परिबा. सो इट स्टेट दैट the vectors to be added are arranged in such a way that the head of the first vector coincide the tail of the second vector, okay. अर्थ कोन? It states that the vectors to be added, suppose this is vector A, okay, and this is vector B, clear play? According to that definition, general rule, it states that the vector to be added are arranged in such a way that the head of the first vector, this is the first vector, this is the head of the first vector, coincides the tail of the second vector. तार अर्थ कोन? Suppose this is the first vector whose head coincide कला कार, this is the second vector, tail of the second vector, clear play? Second vector whose head coincide the tail of the third vector. Again हम जदि नंबर ऑफ वेक्टर को रिप्रेजेंट करिबा ताहले a वेक्टर, b वेक्टर एंड c वेक्टर को हम जदि रिप्रेजेंट करिबा ताहले कोन होची ओके ताहले हम रिप्रेजेंट करिबा दैट इज whose head coincide the tail of the third vector and so on. So that is A vector and this is B vector and this is C vector. So A vector head B vector tail को join करुछि, B vector head C vector tail सहित join होछि, coincide होछि according to that general rule. Okay, then the single vector drawn from the tail point of the first vector. जो बड़का वेक्टर मिलला से वेक्टर कौन होची टेल पॉइंट ऑफ द फर्स्ट वेक्टर आर टेल पॉइंट को नबा फर्स्ट वेक्टर टेल पॉइंट को नबा फर्स्ट वेक्टर टू द हेड ऑफ द लास्ट वेक्टर को हम के नीचे सी वेक्टर नीचे तार हेड को हम कौन करबा कनेक्शन दबा क्लियर पिले दैट रिप्रेजेंट रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर ताको हमें कहबा रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर बोली के रिप्रेजेंट करबा again I repeat state that the vectors to be added are arranged in such a way that the head of the first vector, suppose this is the first vector, this is the second vector and this is the third vector. Now I will add three vectors. So first this is the A vector whose head points coincide with the second vector B vector of tail points. A रो head को B रो tail को हम join करिबा according to that thing. Again B रो head को C रो tail सहित join करिबा. Okay, and so on. Number of vectors हम तीनटा vector consider करू. Then the single vector drawn from the tail point of the first vector. तो देखो ये तीनटा सिना नहीं गेली एबे हम कोन करिबा फर्स्ट वेक्टर रो टेल को हम कोन करिबा रो हम कोन करिबा गुटे वेक्टर को नबा जार हेड पॉइंट टी लास्ट वेक्टर हमर सी वेक्टर टा कोन लास्ट वेक्टर तार हेड पॉइंट को टच करिबा अछि से वेक्टर को कहबा रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर. ओके सो आर वेक्टर को हम रिप्रेजेंट करिबा रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर हिसाब. Clear? So this is the general rule. This is the general rule of vector addition. Okay, so clear पिले प्लीज एटा को नोट करो आपर हम जेति टॉपिक पढिबा आकु बेस करके सब जिंस को डिफाइन करिबा. ओके प्लीज नोट इट. So vector addition by geometrical method ro first देखिबा first property हला when two vector acting in same direction. तार तो करो दीटा वेक्टर नबा जो दीटा वेक्टर की सेम डायरेक्शन रे लाई करछोंते. सपोज दिस इज वेक्टर A and this is vector B. Both are representing in same direction. Clear pile? So what is the direction of resultant vector and their magnitudes? Clear pile? हमें कौन काढिबा ए दीटा वेक्टर जो रिप्रेजेंट होचंती A वेक्टर और B वेक्टर बोथ आर इन सेम डायरेक्शन रे सेमानक रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर रो डायरेक्शन टा को पटे थिबो ता हमें कैलकुलेट करिबा. क्लियर? सो अकॉर्डिंग टू जनरल रूल कौन कहला जनरल रूल इफ नंबर ऑफ वेक्टर्स आर रिप्रेजेंटिंग इन ए प्लेन then if you represent their addition, okay, that means if you represent a vector whose head point connected to tail of the what second vector, again whose head point connected to a tail of the third vector, so they are acting in same direction, therefore the total representation of resultant vector can be represented as tail of the first vector to the head of the last vector, so that represents a resultant vector. In that case A vector and B vector both are acting in same direction. So according to general rule what will happen? According to general rule, as we know that Suppose this is a vector, clear play, and this is b vector. According to general rule, means head of the a vector connected to or coincide to the tail point of the what? B vector. So when two vector acting, amuk pacharchi kono dita vector pacharchi. Therefore resultant vector is given by that is called resultant vector. Okay, so it also represent as r vector, which is equal to a vector plus b vector. Here r vector equal to a vector plus b vector. आमे कोन दरकार जेतले आमे resultant vector पाइबा, vector means कोन, it is the shortest distance between the 2 points. सब आमे displacement को calculate करिबा, shortest distance को initial point रो final point को ही join करदिबा. आर initial point हला एटा, final point हला एटा, दीटा vector रो. So initial point रो final point जो total जो हला सेटा होची r vector, resultant vector. So resultant vector equal to a vector plus b vector. So this is called when two vector acting in same direction. लिखि परिया कोन कहूच पहिले तुम लेखो, when two vector they are acting in same direction, like as a vector and b vector both are acting along same direction. लेखो acting along same direction, then they resultant r vector which is also acting along on that direction. Clear? Clear play? According to that. Clear? So therefore resultant vector r vector which is equal to a vector plus b vector. When two vector are acting along same direction, like as a vector b vector both are acting along same direction, so that a vector whose head points connected to or coincide to b vector whose tail points. Therefore, the resultant vector r vector, which can be represented as tail point of the first to the head point of the last. So r vector equal to a vector plus b vector. Clear? Please note it. So this is the representation of two vector acting in same direction. So this is the formula. R vector equal to what? A vector plus b vector. Clear play? When two vector acting in opposite direction. एबे नबा दीटा वेक्टर को नबा कोन हेतिबे दीटा वेक्टर जाक opposite direction रे रिप्रेजेंट हेतिबे. Suppose this is a vector and this is b vector. Both are acting in opposite direction. So their resultant vector is given by, how to consider? So যদি আমি represent করিবা, in that case suppose this is a vector. Okay, this is a vector and this is b vector. Suppose a vector is bigger, b vector is smaller. Suppose I am consider कले. Clear पिले? मु general rule रे कोन कहिथली, a रो head point को b रो tail point को consider करिबा बोली. किंतु ए जगह रे कोन होछि पिले? चिंता करो. ए जगह रे कोन होछि? a रो opposite रे के जाउछि b जाउछि. तो कोन हला पिले आमे देखिले resultant vector कोन हला एतिकी रो आमे जदी एतिकी फेडीबा ताहले कोन रहइबो resultant रहइबो तार तम पाकर कोन रहइला देखो. So r vector which is equal to what? A vector plus उल्टा अछि a vector जदी ऐड गला b vector कोन अछि opposite direction अछि plus रहइला minus b vector. Clear पिले? If we assume a vector greater than that of b vector. A vector रो mod more than that of B vector रो mod जदि हमें consider करिबा ताहाले हमें पाई परिबा mod not vector that is mod means magnitude r length A vector रो length B vector रो length टारो कोन अछि अधिक अछि तेनु मु जेतले रिप्रेजेंट करली A vector plus B vector which is opposite to that of A vector, so plus minus of B vector. Clear? So R vector which is equal to A vector minus B vector. Clear play? तो तमे लिखिबो कोन लिखिबो when two vector A vector and B vector both are in opposite direction, then resultant vector which is given by R vector equal to A vector plus minus of B vector if A vector रो mod means A रो magnitude means A रो परिमाण suppose गोटे लेंथ नेली से लेंथ टा 6 मीटर हुए जदि A रो तार अर्थ B रो लेंथ टा हेतिबो 4 मीटर तार अर्थ किए बडला परिमाण कार बडला A रो तेनु मु इट लिखली if A vector रो mod greater than that of B vector रो mod then we have to consider A vector plus minus of B vector ताहले आमे जाई कि आगे लिखि परिबा A vector को तापर B vector को रिप्रेजेंट करिबा ए देखिले A vector plus minus of B vector काहे कि A vector opposite रे कि अछि B vector अछि so that is called addition okay A vector minus B vector so this is called resultant vector clear पिले लिखि परिबा R vector रो mod equal to A vector रो mod minus B vector रो mod that is the resultant whose magnitude which is equal to A vector रो mod माने magnitude of A minus magnitude of B काहे कि magnitude of A more as compared to magnitude of B तेनो जो resultant पाइबा ताहाले कोन पाइबा A रो B को फेडिले जहा भी पाइबा ताहा होछि resultant it not a vector it is magnitude A vector or mod clear please note it पिले मु जोडा कहूची सेटा लेख पॉज करिकि क्लियर टिया ब्लैक बोर्ड जेहेतु मो पाखरे जगह नै लिखिया पय तेनु मु डाकी दोछि तमे लेख पॉज करी क्लियर next point is when two vector act at some angle when two vector act at some angle that means if you represent that is A vector and this is B vector they are creating some angle then what will happen so as you know that parallel shifting means that vector becomes shifted parallelly like that suppose this is A vector okay this is A vector as you know that in general rule what is the general rule if a vector acting in a particular direction whose head point coincide with the tail of the second vector so in that given two vector A vector which is acting in a particular direction and B vector which create a certain angle so that B vector becomes shifted like that is the shifting vector B vector को हमें कौन करले शिफ्ट कर देले देखा ना एट थिला शिफ्ट कर देले एट जो द्वारा कि हमें कौन पाइले A रो हेड पॉइंट को B रो कौन हला टेल पॉइंट कनेक्शन हला ओके अकॉर्डिंग टू जनरल रूल सो जनरल रूल कौन कहिथिला आमे जदि A वेक्टर को रिप्रेजेंट करिया गोटे पर्टिकुलर डायरेक्शन रे तार हेड पॉइंट सहित B रो कोन करिबा टेल पॉइंट को जॉइन करिबा सेमिति तार हेड पॉइंट सहित अनदर टेल पॉइंट को जॉइन करिबा जदरे कि हमको नंबर ऑफ वेक्टर मिलिबो सेमानंकर जो रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर पाइबा रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर रो टेल पॉइंट को आमे फर्स्ट वेक्टर रो टेल पॉइंट सहित जॉइन करिबा एंड रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर हेड पॉइंट को लास्ट वेक्टर रो हेड पॉइंट सहित जॉइन करिबा ताहले हमें पाइबा रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर सो ये देखो पिले A वेक्टर रखले हमें B वेक्टर को शिफ्ट करले पैरेलली शिफ्टेड करले एथिला B वेक्टर एथिला को हमें पैरेलली शिफ्ट करले ए जगह को नै गेले क्लियर नेला परे आमे देखिले जे जेतले कोइंसाइड कला आमे जान देले जनरल रूल सैटिस्फाई होची ए वेक्टर हेड पॉइंट सहित बी वेक्टर कोन हला टेल पॉइंट को संयोग हे गेला ताहले हमर जनरल रूल सैटिस्फाई हला तो आमे आको कोन करिया छी क्लोज करिवार अछि तो अकॉर्डिंग टू जनरल रूल कोन कहूची दैट रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर हुज टेल पॉइंट कनेक्टेड टू व्हाट the tail point of the first vector, the tail point of the first vector, and also it connected to head point of the last vector. So this is the last vector. Okay, so if you represent, that is O and that is P and this is Q. Okay, here we consider in theoretical view, let us please note it. Let us consider two vector, A vector and B vector. Both are creating some angle. Lekho pile dakuchi. Okay. If we assume A vector, that is A vector, acting along OP direction, and the B vector becomes shifted parallelly, and that B vector coincides to the head of the A vector. Okay, their tail points. Clear? And that B vector acting along PQ direction. Clear play? Now we join that OQ that represent a resultant vector R vector. So according to general rule, as we know that R vector which is connected to tail point of the first vector and head point of the last vector. Clear? Please note it. So OB equal to OB vector, sorry, OQ vector which is equal to R vector, OP vector equal to A vector, and PQ vector equal to B vector. Therefore, resultant vector R vector equal to what? A vector plus B vector. That is what? What? OP vector plus PQ vector, which is equal to OQ vector. Please note it. So, in that given diagram, OA vector and that is OP vector and PQ vector both are acting in same direction. देखो पिले R head को तार tail, तार head को out tail connection is. So they are in same direction. But resultant vector, first vector tail point को join देछि, last vector head point को join देछि. तार तो कोन हला opposite direction रे गला. तो ए प्रकार वेक्टर लॉ को कहबा ट्रायंगल लॉ ऑफ वेक्टर एडिशन. कोन बोली कहबा ट्रायंगल लॉ ऑफ वेक्टर एडिशन. So what done by triangle law of vector addition? So from above diagram we notified that, so this is the vector A vector and this is B vector. That A vector whose head point connected to tail of the B vector. So they are represented in same order. Clear? And their magnitude as well as directions. They represent their magnitude as well as direction. Okay, but then the resultant whose magnitude and direction, and that resultant vector taken in opposite order. Why it is opposite? Because it connected to tail of the first vector and head of the last vector. जदि आमे जदि एमिति रिप्रेजेंट करथांते O रु A को जाइथांता, A रु B को जाइथांता, B रु C के आस्तिले ताहाले सेम ऑर्डर हेइथांता. किंतु R वेक्टर टा कोन हला ऑपोजिट ऑर्डर रे रिप्रेजेंट हला. ये देखो ए डायरेक्शन जाउची, ये डायरेक्शन किंतु ए डायरेक्शन गला. ओके, जदि ए डायरेक्शन रे जाइथांता ताहाले सेम ऑर्डर हेइथांता. ये कोन हेगला ऑपोजिट ऑर्डर हेगला. क्लियर? सो फ्रॉम अबव डायग्राम we concluded that another law that is known as triangle law of vector addition. So what do you mean by triangle law of vector addition? It states that if two vector acting on a particle at the same time, this is the two vector ଗୋଟେ particle ରେ act ହେଇଛନ୍ତି, okay, same time रे are represented in magnitude and direction. सेमानर कोन अछि magnitude अछि किछि length अछि आ सेमाने गोटे particular direction रे गति करूछंती by the two side of the triangle. तो भाबिनियो पिले एटा गोटे side एटा गोटे side, that is the two side of the triangle. एटा गोटे side two side of the triangle taken in same order. Taken in same order means आर head को तार tail, आर head को तार tail जदि थाए ताकु कहबा same order. जनकर हेड सहित जनकर टेल जदि थाए ताकु कहबा सेम डायरेक्शन और सेम ऑर्डर बोली कहबा. जनकर हेड सहित अन्यर हेड जदि थाए ताहले ताकु कहबा अपोजिट ऑर्डर बोली कहबा. मन रख, जनकर हेड सहित अन्यर टेल जदि थाए से मानन कहबा कोन सेम ऑर्डर. तार अर्थ देखो पिले एटी मोर हातटा अछि, ए हाथ सहित आ जणे लागिला तो मोर हाथ सहित अनदर अपोजिट हैंड लागिला, मोर लेफ्ट हैंड राइट लेफ्ट हैंड सहित अन्यर कोन लागिला राइट हैंड, तो सेटा हला कोन हला सेम ऑर्डर. जदि मोर लेफ्ट हैंड सहित तार जदि लेफ्ट हैंड लागि थांता ताहले से कोन हितांता अपोजिट ऑर्डर हितांता. तो इट कोन होची ए वेक्टर हेड पॉइंट सहित बी वेक्टर रो टेल पॉइंट कनेक्शन होत, तेनु आको कहबा कोन सेम ऑर्डर बोली कहबा. किंतु सेमानर कोन अछि मैग्नीट्यूड अछि एज वेल एज डायरेक्शन अछि. सेमाने दीटा साइड रे रिप्रेजेंट हिचंती. This is the first side and this is the second side. So according to that definition, and that their resultant vector represented in magnitude as well as direction. जो resultant vector पाइले आकु जो r first vector रो tail point सहित last vector head point को जतला हम जॉइन करले ताकु कहबा resultant vector. तार कोन अछि magnitude अछि as well as direction भी अछि. But by the third side of the triangle, so it is first side and second side, that is third side of the triangle taken in opposite order. एबे कहितली opposite order कोन कहबा जनकर हेड सहित जनकर अन्यर हेड मिसिबो बा जनकर टेल सहित अन्यर टेल मिसि जिवो ताहले ता कहबा opposite order. देखो पहिले जदी हमें नै थांते a वेक्टर b वेक्टर एंड c वेक्टर a डायरेक्शन रास्तिले तो ए साइक्लिक फॉर्म रे आस्तिले हमें कोन नै थांते एटा सेम ऑर्डर बोली कहि थांते. ए आर हेड को तार टेल, आर हेड को तार टेल, आर हेड को तार टेल, ताहले एटा कोन हितांता सेम ऑर्डर हितांता. किंतु हमर कोन अछि बे ए डायरेक्शन अछि, ए दि जनकर आर हेड को आर टेल किंतु आर हेड को आर हेड, आर टेल को आर टेल, तेनु ए रिजल्टेंट वेक्टर कोन हेगिला रिप्रेजेंट करला जे ये अपोजिट डायरेक्शन रे रिप्रेजेंट होछि. मन रख, तेनु हम कोन मिलला गुटे लॉ मिलला ताको हला ट्रायंगल लॉ ऑफ वेक्टर एडिशन. Okay, means if two vector acting on a particle, मन रखो by head करो, if two vector acting on a particle at the same time are represented in magnitude as well as direction taken in same order by the two sides, then the resultant, okay, then the resultant represented in magnitude and direction by the third side of the triangle taken in opposite order. Clear? Please note it. Note it pile. That is called triangle law of vector addition. That is called triangle law of vector addition. So it is, this is the graphical representation of two vector in addition formula. Okay, तापर हम पढ़िबा analytic method. Note करो.